You binge, feel guilty, try to make up for it the next day, and then binge again. Welcome to the Binge Dietitian podcast. I'm Jonathan, and I'm here to help you end 24/7 food thoughts, binge eating, and actually enjoy life with food. This episode is for educational and informational purposes only, not to be substituted for medical or personalized advice. Check the link in the description for my recovery resources, and let's get straight to the episode. Do you ever tell yourself, I've ruined it. I did it again. You have no self-control. Right after a binge, do you always end up in you saying terrible things about yourself? I don't know about you, but when I went through episodes of binge eating, I've definitely been there, and it's such a strange feeling. It's a feeling of being angry at yourself, but at the same time, you're trying to find something to place the blame on, but there's no one around you, so you blame yourself. Is that you? Do you try to see yourself in this? It's all too common to end a binge to follow it up with extreme feelings of guilt, shame, and embarrassment. And I want to tell you that it is normal to feel those. But if you want to end your binges, what you do next after your binge is what will either start your recovery or hold you back. So as a dietitian, I'm not that focused on what you binge on, but what I would mostly focus on is how you're eating outside the binges or what happens after the binge. What do you do next? So whether you've had a binge last night or even a few minutes ago, here are 3 things you should do after a binge. So to head straight to number 1, I want you to have compassion for yourself. You might be thinking, but Jonathan, how can I have compassion for myself if I was the one who did this? It's my fault and no one else's. And it may seem that way, but I want you to know that it's not your fault. While it may seem like you were the one that lost control, the best way for you to take back control is to have compassion for yourself. After the binge, I want you to think to yourself, am I going to take this as an opportunity to learn from this? And am I grateful for this? Because my body is binging because it's protecting me. This binge is a sign from my body that I'm lacking something. So things to think about would be, did you skip meals? Or did you eat too little throughout the day or the past few days? Have you been craving for a delicious snack, but you tried to hold it off only for so long for you to find yourself binging on it? Did you actually eat the food that you're craving, but halfway through it, you restricted, you held back, you didn't eat until you were satisfied? I want you to think about these things. Was there any form of restriction that went on? And after the binge, I want you to think, what could I have done to prevent this or prevent this craving from happening? Maybe you didn't restrict at all, and that's completely all right. Because sometimes during binge recovery, you're most likely to have binge episodes, and that's the truth. You can't go from binging 3 times a week to 0 times a week. If you did, then I'm just so happy for you. But to be realistic, I want you to know that as you start to put an end to restrictions, these urges will slowly fall to an end. It's not going to go from 3 times a week, for example, to 0 times a week in just a few days. You may binge 3 times a week and then progress to 2 times a week. And then later on, maybe a week later or a few weeks later, you may go to once a week and then no more. So I want you to have compassion with yourself wherever you are in your binge recovery and to use these binges as an opportunity to reflect and think about what went wrong and how can I prevent this next time. Number 2, after a binge episode, what's your next thought? Oftentimes, our thoughts might be, that's it, I'm going to make up for everything I've binged on. I'm going to be more strict the next time. I'll stay on track. I promise. So do your thoughts revolve around these phrases or something similar? Do you find yourself wanting to skip meals so you can try to make up for your binges? Do you tend to think, that's it, I'm going to avoid the foods I love even more. I'm going to work even harder, only to find yourself having an even more intense craving later on to binge on these foods later, whether it be a few days or even an hour later. Who knows? So this is what is known as the binge restrict cycle. You binge, feel guilty, try to make up for it the next day, and then binge again. So, as tempting as it is to try to make up for your binges by eating very little or skipping meals, this will only lead to another binge down the line. So, what can you do instead? As simple as it sounds, you just have to listen to your hunger and avoid making up for your binge. I understand it could be so difficult to escape the binge restrict cycle because you have to eat regular meals and you just want to lose weight. But whatever anyone has told you, chasing weight loss whilst being in binge eating recovery cannot be done at the same time. You cannot recover from binge eating by trying to reduce these restrictions if you're on a diet, which is a compilation of several restrictions usually. We need to tackle ending binge eating first and then to rebuild a normalized eating pattern with 3 meals a day and snacks in between. And then, once you're free from binges, whatever comes next after being free from your binges and having a comfortable, normalized eating pattern is all up to you. So let's say you had a binge in the evening. Tomorrow, you may not feel hungry, so maybe you could have a light breakfast that you could enjoy. That could be, for example, some toast and butter. I want you to aim to eat until you're around 7 or 8 out of 10 full, with 0 being nauseously hungry and 10 being Christmas dinner full. Then you can have maybe a mid-morning snack of a cereal bar or a couple of pieces of chocolate. Remember, by this time you're around 7 or 8 out of 10 full. So you're not going to be too hungry and not too full to overeat on this chocolate. Then you'll have lunch. Around this time, you might be feeling 5 out of 10 full. So let's try to have something. Let's say a sandwich with bacon, lettuce, and tomatoes. That sounds nice. Now you feel satisfied and full. Then let's go to mid-afternoon. You start to feel a little bit peckish. So you try to have some Greek yogurt with nuts. Now you're topped up to 7 out of 10 fullness. Now it's time for evening. This is the time when the urge to binge usually comes. But this time, since you're eating regular meals in this example, you don't find yourself being ravenously hungry. You're not a 2 out of 10 hungry. You're probably more of a 4 or 5 out of 10 hungry. So here, this is the best moment for you to opt in for a meal you enjoy. So it could be a lasagna or a pizza, but remember, you're less likely to binge on it this time because you've honored your hunger throughout the day with snacks and meals. You're less likely to overindulge and you won't be having these fixated thoughts around takeaway or a massive binge or being worried that you're going to overeat on these. So this is just a typical day of eating where you're focusing on eating regular meals and snacks to keep you satiated and full. So after a binge, the next time you binge, try to listen to your hunger. Give yourself the permission to eat and nourish your body. You'll maybe find that your urges to binge might completely disappear. By the way, just a quick break from the podcast to let you know of my free hunger regulation webinar series, which is in the link in the description of this podcast. There's also an ebook version if you're more of a reader than a watcher. This is the perfect resource I wish I had when I struggled with binge eating years ago, which is used to guide you from everything you need to know, from why we binge, what are the binge triggers, and the eating pattern to stop binge eating. Because when we've been struggling with binge eating for so long, you and your body lose touch of what normal hunger and normal fullness is. You're constantly on feast or famine mode. So head to the link in the description of this podcast for the free hunger regulation resources to have a clear game plan to tackle binge eating for good. Anyway, let's get straight back to the episode. So let's go to number 3, what you should do after a binge. So right after a binge, try not to fall asleep immediately because lying down after consuming a large amount of rich, fried foods, high in fat, can often lead to heartburn, especially if you lie down immediately. So try to give yourself roughly 30 minutes for your food to digest. In the meantime, you could probably prop over some pillows so you're sitting up in the bed. You could then read a book to help your mind get out of the guilt from the binge. You could also watch a TV show that you enjoy, or even go for a very light walk around the block if that's possible. What is important here is you try to avoid lying down immediately and to distract yourself from the guilt of the binge. Remember, see it as an opportunity to reflect on and learn from, then move on. Sometimes after a binge, it could be just normal to feel guilty or shameful or embarrassed. But over time, as you start to eat regular meals and be in tune with your hunger, then you'll start to have this love for food. So that's the 3 things you should do right after a binge. So just a little summary again. Number 1, I want you to have compassion for yourself. Realize that it's not your fault and this can be an opportunity to learn from the binge. What has caused this? Or what has led to this? Was I restricting in any way? What can I do next time to prevent a binge episode from happening? Number 2, try not to make up for your binge and start to eat regularly. We binge because we restrict. So end those restrictions and give yourself the permission to eat regular meals. Breakfast, mid-morning snack, lunch, mid-afternoon snack, and dinner. I want you to give yourself the permission to eat the foods you enjoy. And remember, you won't overindulge on these foods you love because you're giving yourself permission to stay comfortably satisfied. And number 3, right after a binge, try not to fall asleep or lie down immediately. Give yourself around 30 minutes to let your stomach start to settle and digest the food to prevent heartburn. In the meantime, try an activity that can help distract you out of the guilt. So this could be listening to your favorite podcast, reading a great book, watching a favorite episode of your favorite TV show, or maybe even going for a light walk if you think you can manage that. Remember that every binge can be used as a learning opportunity. So that's it. Thank you so much for listening, and I want you to know that I offer one-to-one consultations, and I can support you to your journey to being binge-free. Check out my services in the link in the description of this podcast, and also check out my freebies too. If you found this podcast episode helpful, I would really appreciate it if you rated this podcast well so other people struggling with binge eating can also find more tips for binge eating recovery. Who knows? Someone might have had a binge episode very recently, and this episode will hopefully stumble into their arms and give them the tips to prevent a recurrence of another binge episode in the future. So anyway, thank you guys, and I'll see you next time. Bye! Struggling with binge eating? Gain access to my exclusive self-paced binge eating freedom course found in the link in the description of this podcast. My course is everything I wish I knew when I struggled with binge eating, but it's all wrapped up into one easy to understand platform. You'll finally learn how to put an end to binge eating and put an end to food dictating everything you do, controlling your life. Access it now in the link in the description of this podcast.